I am very delighted to welcome all of you, all the participants, to this year's Freie Universität Berlin Institute of Korean Studies Summer Special Lecture Series. My name is Henrik Johannemann. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Korean Studies, also a PhD candidate at the Graduate School of East Asian Studies. The topic, as you all know, of this lecture series for today and for the next 2 weeks is the contentious Koreans, civil society, social movements, and human rights struggles in South Korea. And I'm very happy that we have many renowned speakers today, Professor Shin Jinwook, and also in the next few days, also activists, not only scholars. For a short welcome address, I give the word to Professor Eun-Jung-Lee. Yes, Professor Lee, please.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Eun-Jung Lee. I'm the director of the Korean Studies at FUBerlin and the director of the Graduate School of East Asian Studies at FUBerlin too. I'm very welcome you to our lecture series, and this is our 8th summer school program. We had tried in last 9 years to give our students different views on Korea and from the different perspective. For that purpose, we organized this special lecture series. I'm very thankful to our first Henrik Johannemann for preparing this wonderful program. It's not just a well planned, but the whole contents of these lectures, you will see that it is wonderful. I hope that you can enjoy these whole lectures with us together. And thanks again to be with us. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Without much more further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Shin Jinwook to you shortly. He's a professor of sociology at Chungang University in Seoul, South Korea. And we're very happy having him today at an event organized by Freie Universität Berlin, because actually he's an alumnus of our institution. He received his PhD in sociology at Freie Universität Berlin. After that, he was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and a visiting professor at Freie Universität, and also at the University of Graz in Austria in 2018. He served as a director of the DAAD Center for German and European Studies at the Chungang University, and he is a vice president of the Korean Association of Social Policy. We're very happy having Professor Shin today because he's an eminent expert on social movements and civil society in South Korea. His research interests include also democracy, social inequality, and the welfare state. Besides a large number of research articles, he has also published books, including Modernization and Civil Society in South Korea. Another book was Growing Inequality and Its Impacts in Korea. And a third volume that he has published is Multiple Inequalities, the Structure of Inequalities in South Korean Society. This is why I give the floor to Professor Shin Jinwook now. Thank you so much for joining our lecture series.
Hallo, guten Morgen. Zunächst möchte ich ganz kurz auf Deutsch meine Grußworte sagen. Es freut mich sehr, Sie alle heute begrüßen zu dürfen, obwohl wir uns nicht in Gesichtern sehen können. Vor allem aber vermisse ich meine Kolleginnen und Kollegen und die Studenten am Institut für Koreanstudien. Ich hoffe, dass wir uns entweder in Berlin oder in Seoul so bald wie möglich treffen werden, nachdem die Corona-Krise endlich einmal vorbei ist. Let me share the PowerPoint screen. So, okay. My name is Jinwook Shin. I'm teaching and studying political sociology and social movements. So it is a great pleasure for me to be invited to the special lecture series about the theme, the contentious Koreans, with a focus on civil society, social movements, and human rights struggles. The title, The Contentious Koreans, reminds me of a book written by Charles Tilly, The Contentious French, I think published in 1984. I'm taking on the first lecture, opening the series comprising 10 lectures. Today, I would like to provide a broad overview for the subsequent 9 lectures that will be focusing on substantial topics, including human rights, environment, feminism, sexual minorities, and workers' struggles. But my lecture will not be limited to describing the chronology of social movements and protest actions in South Korea, but I'll try to systematically formulate the characteristics of South Korean social movements in each historical period and their socio-political environments and consequences. I hope that you enjoy my lecture. Before I come to the issues on Korean social movements, I would like to at first briefly comment on what social movement is and what is not. I think it is important to note that it is indeed true that social movement is a form of collective action, but not all collective actions are social movements or develop into social movements or have the potential of becoming social movements. Social movement is a specific form of collective action aimed at social reform, which is based on and often tends to form collective goals, norms, and identities. To be called social movement and not just a single protest event, it must be able to continue collective campaigns for a particular period of time based on a certain level of organization or community or network structure. In contemporary democratic societies, we always hear about and we often observe and we sometimes take part in social movements. But as a student of social sciences and humanities, we need to understand more deeply why social movements matter from the perspective of our normative visions of a good society and good life. I think the starting point is the fact that our society and our lives have problems of which the causes, persistence, and consequences are not individual, but social in nature. The second important fact is that among the many social problems we have, only particular ones can attract public attention, become political agenda, and find solutions for reform. In modern democracy, actors in institutional politics such as the government and political parties must fulfill the function of articulating collective interests and channeling them into political institutions. But regrettably, such ideas often are not realized. Therefore, where political institutions fail, social movements play a key role in diverse ways. First, by participating in social movements, people become conscious of social problems and come to define their causes and possible solutions in one way or another. Also, the process of the development of social movements is at the same time the process of building collective agents of reforming the society and our everyday life. It is also the process of symbolic construction of common experiences, identities, values, and goals of action. In addition, social movements challenge the established social order, dominant discourses, ways of thinking, and lifestyles. They struggle to abolish problematic institutions, practices, and power structures, both at macro level and in daily life. Furthermore, participants of social movements imagine new cultures and institutions and try to move the reality toward their ideas of another world. All these changes will be made possible by social movement activities in cases particular conditions have been fulfilled. Here is an example of interesting historical case. During the time of the US-American New Deal in the 1930s, a few radical movements for social reform emerged from below. Such movements often were idealistic and looked populist in today's terminology, but they gained the support and participation of many citizens, and such popularity put strong pressure on the Roosevelt government to implement more aggressive reform policies. That is a typical political mechanism in which the seemingly idealistic claims of social movements become effective and powerful in realpolitik. Another interesting point about the American social movements during the New Deal era is that they brought to the fore many reform agendas that are still and even more popular and relevant today. For example, public regulation of the concentration of wealth, the idea of basic income and minimum wage, universal public pension, regardless of occupation and earning, strong public regulation of financial systems, and so on. This imagination and this creativity, this courage to dream another world have been the most fundamental source of power of social movements. As social scientists, we must speak with empirical data. In these two graphs, you can see that the increase in the number of social movement organizations on women's issues and on civil rights and minorities' human rights issues in the United States is closely related to the increase in the frequency of congressional hearings related to these issues. So, social movement studies have a wealth of evidence about such a political and social impact of social movements and are exploring the conditions and mechanisms of such influence. In particular, social movements play a special role when institutional power and elites keep silent where there are problems and aspirations for change. If nobody speaks up where there's a problem, the problem will be neither known nor heard far from being resolved. In this respect, it is important to remember that Korea was under foreign occupation during the first decades of the modern era, and after national liberation, South Korea was under authoritarian rule for further several decades. Under such unfavorable historical conditions, people had to be their own speaker. That is the historical background against which a strong resistant civil society and a long tradition of social movements emerged in South Korean history. Let me begin with the birth of social movement in Korea during the era of Japanese rule. Scholars who study the history of social movements, including Charles Tilly, say that social movements are a product and also an important part of modern society and politics. Conscious and organized collective action in the form of social movements appeared in full scale in the 19th century and began to develop rapidly in the early 20th century. Interestingly, in East Asian countries such as China, Japan, and Korea too, social movements and modern forms of contentious politics emerged in this era. In other words, it is necessary to pay attention to this contemporaneity of the birth of social movements and contentious politics in East Asia and in Western societies. In Korea, the peasant war in the late 19th century was a prehistory for this development, but the most important starting point was the March the First Movement in 1919. The real sociological significance of this movement lies not in the manifesto of a few national leaders, but in the fact that millions of people from all over the country connected with each other, formulated common ideas for change, printed leaflets, and organized collective action. So, social movement organizations and activities in Korea developed dramatically in the decades following the March the First Movement, 1919. Though under the rule of the Japanese military police complex, various movement sectors such as labor, peasant, youth, and religious movements, as well as the national liberation movements, grew throughout the 1920s until the mid-1930s. if we are not aware of the fact that social movements, protests, and contentious politics continued to spread to cities and rural areas across the country during this period, we cannot explain how such tremendous democratic enthusiasm could explode from below right after the national liberation in 1945, and how the April Revolution in 1960 could take place just 7 years after the devastating Korean War ended. During the period of Japanese occupation, workers' resistance was also very active. From the early 1920s, many labor unions and labor movement organizations were established across the country, and workers frequently conflicted either with Korean landowners or Japanese police to protect their organizational resources and economic interests. Many of these organizations were destroyed by the Japanese police after mid-1930s, but workers and activists quickly rebuilt the organizations and resumed their activities after national liberation in 1945. And then workers were again oppressed by the authoritarian rulers and state violence of South Korea, but they could build up the democratic trade union movements from the 1970s. Now let's move on to the South Korean social movements after the 1960s and think about noticeable changes and continuities during the past decades. I'd like to roughly distinguish 3 periods in consideration a few criteria, such as the main agents of the movement and modes of action, mobilization structure, and communication structure, and political environments. The first period, from the early 1960s to the late 80s, is characterized by development of democratization movements or pro-democracy movements, which made a decisive contribution to the resistance against dictatorship and the eventual democratic transition in 1987. The second period began from 1987 and continued to the mid-2000s under Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun's liberal government. During this period, the civil society organizations often replaced a role that could not be fulfilled by underdeveloped party politics in reform process. Then the third period began with the outbreak of the first large-scale candlelight protest in 2002. The most salient feature of this third period is the rise and spread of a new type of citizens' political activism based on the spontaneous and decentralized large-scale protest movements. And finally, I will also mention the most recent and extremely interesting changes after the 2010s, including new generation of labor and women's movements and climate action, and the growth of grassroots community movements at local level. Along with such significant changes for the past decades, we can also identify notable continuities. What I find most salient is the persistence of 3 ideational pillars in South Korean civil society in general and social movements in particular. The first one is Minju, the value of democracy, understood not only as representative democracy, but also participation and autonomy of citizens. The second is Minjuk in Korean language, the idea of national independence, anti-imperialism, and inter-Korean reconciliation and cooperation. And thirdly, the concept of Minjung, which contains the value orientation towards universal human dignity and human rights, social justice, and equality. The historical roots of these ideas can be traced back to the social thoughts in China and Korea in the early 20th century, but we can observe their recurrent appearance throughout 20th century and even in the candlelight demonstrations of the 21st century. Now, let me get into the details of each period. The first period concerns the pro-democracy movements and other sectors of social movements under dictatorship from the 1960s to the late 1980s. South Korea was under authoritarian rule for about 4 decades from the establishment of Republic of Korea 1948 until the democratic transition in 1987. There were very short periods of democratic politics in 1960 and 1979, but each time it has been broken down by military coup. The military government also committed massacre as a reaction to the democratic uprising in Gwangju in 1980. But during this long time of dictatorship and state terror, the spheres of independent civil society continued to grow. It was, above all, the democratization movements that made such development possible. In the 1960s, the protests largely depended on individual dissidents and their declaratory acts, but it is noteworthy that from the late 1960s, important protest organizations began to grow at the national level. Most important at this time were the democratization movements that were linked to religious groups. Above all, the Protestant and the Catholic churches, such as Catholic Youth Workers and Evangelical Urban Industrial Mission from the 1950s and 60s. In the 1970s, university students' democratization movements and the democratic trade union movements have achieved significant progress, both in terms of their organizations and the recognition from other parts of the society. A fundamental change within the protest movements in South Korea occurred in the early 1980s as a result of and as a response to the military massacre in Gwangju, the capital city of the southwest province of South Korea. After this event, the protest movements concentrated on strengthening their organizational power and also radicalized their ideology and action methods. In particular, the university students' movements were finally organized from national level to the individual universities and department units, and they struggled with the military state power by highly organized and disciplined collective actions, often using violent methods of protest. Along with the radicalization of social movements in the 1980s, the pro-democracy protests against the dictatorship became more frequent, as is shown in the bar chart on the left side. This is 1980s. So as the dictatorship lasted longer, the resistance did not fade, but rather the clashes between the state and protesters have intensified, as you can see in the line graph on the right side. This means the South Korean civil society in general, and social movements in particular, did not only continue to grow despite the dictatorship, but they also have been shaped in the course of the intense conflicts with the authoritarian rulers and their state apparatuses, including the police, the military, and the information agency. Another important thing you should know about the South Korean social movements before democratization is their diversity in many aspects, including the participants, issues, interests, and goals of collective action. It is indeed true that during this period, most social movements in South Korea worked closely together for the common goal of democracy and freedom, but these movements did not have a single purpose and ideology. So, relatively independent ideologies, participant groups, and organizational networks were developed in various fields such as democracy and human rights, labor, economic justice, women, environment, and education. Such diversity enabled the immediate sectoral differentiation of social movements right after democratization. Now we came to the period after democratic transition in 1987. Overall, after democratization, as you can see here, the number of civil society organizations rose steeply. The number of organizations in South Korean civil society not only increased in the 1990s, right after the democratization, but even more rapidly during the 2000s. While in the 1990s, many movements in the fields of political reform and women and environment were established, it was the organizations in the sector of social welfare that led the quantitative surge of South Korean civil society organizations in the 2000s. After introducing the democratic systems in South Korea, the political environments of social movements have changed fundamentally. The political opportunities for civil society have greatly expanded. The oppression by political power has been weakened, and the institutionalized sectors such as the government, parliament, political parties, business, and the media have become more open to cooperation with civil society actors. With these changes, new trends of social movements called citizens movements, or in Korean language, 시민운동, have grown throughout the 1990s. In contrast to the protesters under dictatorship, these movements relied mainly on relatively more moderate means of action and put importance to gaining wide support from public opinion. From the early 1990s, the citizens' movements, 시민운동, became a crucial actor in the reform process in various spheres, including political democratization, gender, environment, social movement, etc. In particular, organizations with rich human resources and organizational financial resources have nearly replaced much of the roles which are normally expected to be fulfilled by the government and political parties in advanced democracies. As for the themes of citizens' movements in 1990s, the most noticeable change was the diversification of the movement themes and values. Accordingly, the former democratization movements have been differentiated into various sectors, including labor, women, peace, environment, human rights, education, consumer rights, etc. However, reform movements also continued the tradition of the three ideational pillars I've mentioned before, such as political democratization, economic justice, and equality, and also inter-Korean reconciliation and cooperation. Another noteworthy change in the South Korean social movements in the 1990s was that the newly emerged reform movements actively utilized institutionalized channels such as the judiciary, political parties, the government, and the mass media. The movement organizations raised issues through cooperation with media and also collaborated with political parties to introduce new policy and provided policy contents to government agencies. As an example, the lawsuit became an efficient means of social movements. Movement organizations and the lawyers associated with them tried to achieve the reform goals by making political corruption or abuse of power or irregularities of the employers the subject of legal disputes and the object of media spotlight. These citizens' movements that were established after democratization both have made great contributions in South Korean society and created new problems for social movements and South Korean democracy. On the one side, they undertook the role of representation of citizens' grievances and claims in times of underdeveloped party politics right after the introduction of party democracy in the 1990s. Especially the huge contributions made by large-scale movement organizations such as People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy and Korean Women's Associations United or Korean Federation of Environmental Movements. However, there were also growing problems in the new era, such as the narrowing distance between movement leaders and political power of liberal parties, and also the minor role of ordinary citizens in the course of professionalization and bureaucratization of movement activities. The problems or limitations of the citizens' movements in the 1990s constituted the historical background against which new trends of citizens' activism emerged from the mid-2000s. The most salient characteristics of this new period of South Korean social movements and contentious politics was the spontaneous self-mobilization of non-organized citizens independent of established movement organizations using information and communication networks and their own online social networks. Unlike the social movements in the prior periods, in which movement organizations and their strategic action played a crucial role, these fundamental changes have occurred in these new protest cultures of the 21st century, symbolized by the candlelight protest or candlelight vigil. Citizens' gatherings expanded rapidly through independent communication by the new information and communication technologies. Participants have greatly diversified by age, gender, occupation, and prior experience of protest. The structure of the relationships among the protest participants have been extremely decentralized. As the participants of protest action have grown in size and diversified greatly, radical action methods have almost disappeared. Since the 2000s, violent and illegal behavior at assemblies and demonstrations has significantly decreased, and today, violence and illegal actions are virtually non-existent in any kind of protest events. As a result, the policing strategy of public authorities too has changed fundamentally, such that physical threats, suppression, and arrests against protest participants have become very rare in South Korea. So here I'd like to present some photographs of large-scale candlelight protests in the 21st century, which show how many ordinary citizens are now joining political activism and how extraordinary the political consequences of their participation have been. Here you can see the teenagers and children are joining the public assembly and street rally, making free speech on the stage, holding the candle and waving the flags. Music performances by popular singers are also an important part of South Korea's new demonstration culture. All these things show that from the early 2000s, the collective actions for the expression of political opinions of the citizens are not exclusively a matter of the activists of movement organizations and other civil society associations, but are made by a great variety of citizens in respect of age, gender, occupation, so on. These are photos taken from the sky. They look very similar. Hundreds of thousands of people are gathering at the city center of Seoul with candles in their hands, demonstrating a beautiful spectacle like a festival. But each one is showing different protest events. The first one is from the protest in 2002, the second from 2004, the third from 2008, and the fourth from the protest against President Park Geun-hye from 2016 to 17. This striking similarity of the scenes of the different protest events in the 21st century South Korea tells us that a new form of political activism has become a repeating pattern, that is, the candlelight protest by ordinary citizens who want to convey their opinions to society and the power holders by way of demonstrating the solidarity of an extraordinarily great number of citizens, instead of provocative action like occupation, firebombs, or sit-ins. An absolute majority of the participants of these protest actions were, so to speak, ordinary citizens. Ordinary in the sense that they were not deeply involved in political matters in their daily life. But the issues they have raised touch the core of national and international politics. For example, The protesters in 2002 demanded revision of the agreement between the US and South Korean government on the status of the US Army stationed in South Korea. The protest in 2004 was an action against the attempt of impeachment of the then President Roh Moo-hyun by the conservative-dominated National Parliament. The protest in 2008, which lasted for more than 4 months, was triggered by the US-Korea agreement on the import of American beef products in South Korea without sufficient sovereign rights of inspection by South Korean government. And finally, the goal of the protest in 2016-17 was the immediate resignation or the impeachment of the then President Park Geun-hye for her abuse of power and the violation of rule of law. Correspondingly, these protests have often made impacts of tremendous political significance. The protest in 2002 influenced the surprising victory of Roh Moo-hyun, who advocated more autonomy from the United States in the presidential election in December of the same year. The protest in 2004 ended with the Constitutional Court's rejection of the impeachment of President Roh Moo-hyun by the National Parliament. And in 2008, as a reaction to the massive protest, the then President Lee Myung-bak had to apologize twice and abandon a large part of his neoliberal projects, such as privatization of major public enterprises and radical reduction of public welfare expenditure. Finally, the protest in 2016 and 17 led to the impeachment and eventual dismissal of the then President Park Geun-hye, who is currently in jail. Of course, how these political situations will affect South Korea's democracy and political stability is another question. However, it is of great importance that in the 21st century, citizen activism and political participation have come to have a profound influence on South Korean institutional politics. Finally, let me tell you about some of the new trends in South Korean social movements in the late decade from the 2010s. We have seen earlier that flexible, spontaneous, and networked civic activism has come to prominence in the 21st century in South Korea. However, that does not mean that the activities of civil society organizations have generally declined in South Korean society. On the contrary, the number of NPOs in South Korea continued to grow in 2010s. And above all, the NPOs working at the local level have been driving the overall quantitative growth in the total number of NPOs in South Korea. In other words, even if the centrality of some large-scale movement organizations has recently weakened, movement organizations operating locally are steadily enhancing their place within a more decentralized ecology of South Korean civil society. It is also interesting to note that the frequency of media coverage of the demonstrations in the 2000s increased sharply. The orange bar graph on the right side is the result of my analysis of the frequency of reports of demonstrations in 19 nationwide and economic newspapers in South Korea from 2000 to 2020. In contrast, the blue bar graph on the left side shows the actual frequency of demonstrations according to the police statistics. While the frequency of demonstrations has not shown a consistent trend, the frequency of media coverage of rallies and demonstrations has continued to increase in the 2010s. The fact that the media are reporting the rallies, demonstrations more and more frequently means that citizen activism and their political expression have the potential to influence politics and public opinion even more. From the perspective of international comparison too, the participation of South Korean citizens in political activism today is no longer lower than in Western countries. According to the results of World Value Survey for the period from 2017 to 2020, South Korean citizens' political participation is relatively high among non-European countries, and especially South Korea's participation in online political activism is the highest among comparable countries, such as political action online by organizing political activities, events, and protests. Well, a more detailed explanation about the place of South Korea from international comparison in this respect can be found in my chapter on South Korean social movements in the upcoming Oxford Handbook of South Korean Politics. In addition to these overall organizational and participatory developments, another important change in the 2010s is the fact that new generations and new streams of social movements are growing continuously. One of the most noteworthy examples is the emergence of various types of precarious workers' movements, such as the Youth Union and the Alba Union of Part-Timers, the Rider Union, and the unions of apartment security guards, and so on. In addition, young generation social movements are creating new organizations and tactics, and new issues and discourses, and new challenges and experiments in many important fields, such as labor, finance, housing, and climate, feminism, and so on. In addition, many locally based cooperatives and social enterprises and communities are spreading, and such organizations and communities have been developing cooperative governance with the government bodies, primarily at the local level. These two pictures you see here are the results of an analysis conducted by one of my outstanding doctoral students, Jung Bo-young, about the networks of joint action between various social movements led by younger generations in 2015 and 2019, respectively. Here, if you compare these two pictures, we can see that both the number of social movement organizations and the density of cooperation among them have developed rapidly in just a few years. Now I keep talking about the social movements by young generations or new generation of social movements in a sense that is different from youth movement. If the term youth movements mainly refer to a movement that focuses on the generational issues and identities of the youth, what I call young generation social movements or new generation of social movements refer to social movement targeting at various issues and agendas led by younger constituents and adherents of social movements. In these two graphs, the movements that are playing the most decisive role among the new social movements led by young generations in South Korea are mainly those working on the issues of labor, housing, and the financial difficulties of precarious young people. Several characteristics of the new social movements in South Korea in the 2010s can be mentioned. First, that they value the experience and participation and voice of the people directly involved in the social problems in question. And second, self-mobilization based on individuals' spontaneity and self-decision rather than centralized organizational mobilization. And third, a horizontal and decentralized communication structure rather than hierarchical organization. And fourth, the tendency to reject elitist social movements relying on some leaders of high reputation or with networks to political power. Here we can find interesting similarities with the network citizens activism symbolized by the candlelight visual from the early 2000s in many ways. In other words, a new generation of social movements now is emerging in the cultural atmosphere. cultural spaces opened by consecutive large-scale candlelight visuals since the early 2000s. Now, before I wrap up my lecture, I'd like to finally add some comments about current issues in today's social movement study at international level. Although this list is not exhaustive at all, it includes particularly important themes of social movement research and related discussions in researchers' community. For example, generalized political activism and the coming of social movement society, or in German, Bewegungsgesellschaft, and network social movements in the age of individualization and the information society, as was theorized by the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells, and also the precarious new social movements and their cultural challenges, especially the youth activism, and the topic of globalization, global civil society, transnational social movements, especially the so-called global justice movements. Most of all, many researches has been done by Italian political scientist Donatella Della Porta, or German sociologist Dieter Rucht, and finally, the spread and political success of right-wing popular movements. And I'd like to stress the importance of the modernization of their tactics, discourses, and action repertoires of the far-right groups. So, for example, you may be able to analyze how the hashtag activism of feminist movements, or climate action, or precarious youth movements is currently working in South Korea, and how the socially disadvantaged people can make a difference through such online actions. Furthermore, you may be able to analyze the process by which the symbols and discourses of the Me Too campaign spread at the global level, and how young women participating in the so-called young feminist movements in South Korea are influenced by and contribute to these global feminist movements. And you may also consider investigating the experiences of social movement participants in South Korea, in Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, developing networks of transnational solidarity and identities through the internet and social media, despite the many geographic obstacles, curricular restrictions, and pandemic situations. So this is the last slide. At the end of my opening lecture for the special lecture series on contentious Koreans, I'd like to quote some sentences written by American historian Howard Zinn, which I think express the spirit of social movement in the most beautiful words I know. Let me read these sentences. Revolutionary change does not come as one cataclysmic movement, but as an endless succession of surprises, moving zigzag toward a more decent society. We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can quietly become a power no government can suppress, a power that can transform the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Shin, for these very fitting closing remarks and for your whole presentation. I'm very impressed and delighted that you gave us an overview, a great overview, not only of social movements in Korea, but also into the broadest perspective of social movements in Korea, but also worldwide, and how research can go on. I think this is also a good inspiration for our students for their bachelor thesis or for doctoral thesis to come in the future. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Professor Shin, and have a good afternoon, good evening, or whatever you are, good morning. I don't know where all our participants are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.